The Mission, Chapter 4. Go ahead, Nathan. The floor is yours. Tell me what secrets you've uncovered. To solve the case, the first question we must ask is this: why did Jerome come to Bristol? Plymouth was the center of clockmaking, and Jerome had trained under the most successful clockmakers of them all, Eli Terry. It would have been easier for him to stay in Plymouth, close to his network and his suppliers. But you have to understand that Jerome had big plans. He wanted to be more successful than Eli Terry, and Bristol represented a fresh playing field, unlike the crowded Plymouth market. Bristol's Pequabic River had numerous open riverfront spots where you could find water power without having to share it with any other manufacturer. Bristol also had a large labor pool of talented craftsmen available for contract labor. And so Jerome transferred himself to Bristol, but he also brought with him unique tradecraft that he learned from Eli Terry, Eli's mass production methods. Jerome set up his Bristol workshop to mass produce cases for clocks, using the same factory layouts and division of labor and specialized circular saw machines that Eli utilized in Plymouth. But Jerome was missing something very important. Cases were only that, cases. He still needed clock movements to go inside those cases, and all of the quality clock movements were still being made by Eli Terry or by Eli's former apprentices, Seth Thomas and Silas Hoadley. And these guys weren't going to sell their movements to Jerome, because Jerome was no longer their apprentice. Now he was their competitor. But Jerome realized that he didn't need to buy their clock movements. He already witnessed Terry's methods for creating clock movements and knew their design parameters, so Jerome could make his own. All he needed to do was hire contract labor to recreate the different design elements of a clock movement and put it all together to make a replica of Terry's clock movement. So he found an especially talented craftsman named Chauncey Boardman in Bristol, and Jerome taught him how to create the same clock movements that Eli Terry was making, with a few slight modifications as not to impinge on Terry's patents. And in this way, Jerome founded a large-scale clockmaking business in Bristol that soon rivaled the clock empire of Eli Terry in Plymouth. So the next question is, if you were Eli Terry, how would you feel about this? And we have our answer, because soon after Jerome came to Bristol, Eli Terry followed him. Eli sent over his relative, Samuel Terry, to execute a massive real estate purchase in Bristol, buying up a series of properties with mill capabilities and riverfront access. Then he sent another relative to start up a new clockmaking operations in Bristol under the Terry name, the successor to this enterprise today being none other than Theodore Terry. But even the Terry name and significant startup capital was not enough to displace Jerome, because Jerome was moving faster than everyone else. In the old days of clockmaking, a clockmaker and an apprentice would work together to create a clock by hand, one by one. As the clock shop grew more successful, the clockmaker could outsource different elements of the operation by hiring contract labor to make the movements or the cases, all of which required more investment and thus new partnerships, but it all facilitated expansion and increased output. And more importantly, it created opportunities and jobs, a big new demand for contract labor and clock part suppliers. This business cycle of escalation, a wagon wheel of outsourcing and investment, was the secret sauce of Bristol's economic expansion. And here again, we find that Jerome was different from the others. He didn't participate in the shared wagon wheel of economic expansion. He strived for the opposite. Jerome didn't want long-term partnerships. He didn't want outsourced labor. He preferred to take full ownership of his enterprises and bring all the clockmaking in-house under his control. And his new factories were the evolution of this model. No longer would Jerome rely on contractors or suppliers that could disrupt his assembly line. No longer would he rely on partners who could dispute or delay or litigate his business decisions. His new factories brought all the powers of clock production under one roof, from the ownership to the movement to the case to the labor to the packaging, all the way down to the delivery via his transportation network in New Haven. And this fully controlled enterprise allowed him to create maximum efficiency in the clock business and deliver a consistently quality product for a very competitive price. But the other result was that it degraded Bristol's engine of economic expansion, of opportunity. Everyone else's businesses, from the contract laborers to the suppliers to the investors, lost value, lost their livelihood. This disruption, this threat, is what Jerome's factories represented. So when you ask the question, who profits when Jerome's factories goes up in flames? The answer is every other clockmaker in town. Everyone is a suspect. But there's another layer here. Let's consider the timing. At the moment Jerome lost his factory and was forced out of Bristol, who was in the best position to claim his business? Who became the next largest clockmaker once Jerome was out of the way? Terry and Andrews. And so the minute that Jerome was out of the picture, Theodore Terry and his shop profited immensely. And what we know about the Terrys is that they were extremely competitive when it came to Jerome. Not only did they lock him out of purchasing their clock movements, but when the Terrys sold their trade secrets in metallurgy to the springmaker Edward Dunbar, their written contract stipulated that Dunbar could resell this tradecraft to any others except for one person, Chauncey Jerome. So we know that the Terrys had a deep rivalry with Jerome. And we know that once Jerome was run out of town, Theodore Terry's clock shop profited tremendously. So there's a motive right there. Rivalry, revenge. But what about the method of the crime? The fire. Who would have experience with this type of arson? And again, there's a case to be made for Theodore Terry. What I learned is that Theodore, as a young man, was eager to earn a name for himself in the clockmaking business. But he was always tied to his father, Samuel. You see, Theodore had a problem. He wanted a big clock shop with big profits. But his father had already rented much of the family's real estate properties in Bristol to other clockmakers, such as Ray and Carpenter, who were occupying precious workshop space that Theodore could have used for his own enterprises. Theodore needed that workshop and wanted to evict them, but his father objected. Samuel made a contract with the current occupants of the shop, and Samuel was a man of his word, a man of honor. So isn't it a bit convenient that Ray and Carpenter's workshop was hit by a mysterious fire, which destroyed the tenants' operations? And once the structures were rebuilt, who do you think was the next tenant to move into the new workshop once Ray and Carpenter were run out by the fire? That's right, Theodore Terry. That's a bold claim, Nathan. I'm not finished, Mr. Peck. The rivalry between the Terrys and Jerome didn't end there, did it? After the Bristol fire, Jerome moved all of his clockmaking operations to New Haven and rebuilt everything bigger than ever before. In fact, Jerome was turning out more clocks in New Haven using his centralized mass production methods than he was ever able to in Bristol. And being right next to New Haven's port, it was even easier to export his clocks to New York, to southern markets, and even overseas. Jerome was in New Haven, but here again, we find Theodore Terry, don't we? And again, another mysterious fire. Let's remember that right after Theodore moved from Bristol to Ansonia, his clock shop was conveniently burned down, a loss which he empowered himself to sell as a salvaged clock enterprise to P.T. Barnum, who then repackaged it with additional business losses and resold this one big poison pill of debt to Jerome's son when Jerome was out of town. And here again, we find the downfall of Chauncey Jerome's businesses, this time in New Haven, with Theodore Terry right there in the background. Nathan, unbelievable. You're right. Well, Mr. Peck, I'm here to tell you that the person responsible for firebombing Jerome's factories in Bristol is not Theodore Terry. What do you mean, Nathan? I'm not following. I do believe Theodore Terry started the fire that chased away his father's tenant for his own gain. But I don't believe that he's the one behind the Jerome fire or the poison pill that bankrupted Jerome's New Haven operations. There was another instigator, far more patient, far more devious at play here. It's my belief that this instigator observed how Theodore used a well-timed catastrophe to his own advantage, and then used the same nefarious tactics on a much grander scale and over a much longer course of time. This instigator waited for exactly the right moment when Jerome's operations were fully built, fully invested and ready to start operations, and then he struck and burnt it all down. This instigator also knew that Jerome's enterprises in Bristol were being supported with money loaned by prominent investors in Bristol, like the Barnes family, and that by burning down Jerome's factories, he would also be burning up the capital invested there, thereby weakening Bristol's investor class. Allow me now to summarize the case. To solve a crime, you must examine three things: motive, method, and opportunity. The opportunity presented itself when Jerome consolidated all of his Bristol operations in one place, put all his eggs in one basket, so to speak. The method we know to be fire, the great enemy and hazard of all these wood-framed workshops. Only now are we seeing Bristol clockmakers make the big investments necessary to build factories in brick, which are more resistant to fire. But motive is a far more difficult thing to assess. What we have seen is that Bristol clockmakers, all being men of the congregation, had a code of honor among each other. Even when Chauncey Boardman was forced out of business by the clockmakers' protective cartel, he was allowed to be an investor in the Bristol Brass Company and brought back into the same circles he was ousted from. So a typical businessman in Bristol would lack a strong motive to strike another businessman, as it went against their gentleman's code of honor. But Bristol is a big place. Let's remember that there are also clockmakers on the fringe, more distant from the honorable Congregationalists of Federal Hill. The Forestville clockmakers. The Manross family could be a suspect here, but their legacy traces back to the early settling of Bristol, which would bind them to the same code of honor as the Federal Hill families. But consider the case of J.C. Brown for an instant. He rose to prominence in Forestville. He was the ringleader of the protective cartel's plot to force Boardman out of the clockmaking business for disloyally selling to the New York merchants. So we know that J.C. Brown had a disposition to nefarious affairs against his competitors. And we also know that his clock operations, being in Forestville, were well positioned to take advantage of any discord among the Bristol downtown clockmakers, especially a catastrophe on the scale of the Jerome fire. But Nathan, J.C. Brown is bankrupt now, isn't he? That's right, Mr. Peck. What I'm telling you is that J.C. Brown is not the instigator, but he's an important clue. Everything I've uncovered about the motive behind the Jerome fire leads me to believe that the instigator is someone not a member of the Federal Hill congregations, someone without a family legacy in clockmaking, and somebody who existed outside the Brotherhood of Clockmakers with no allegiance to their code of honor. What if I told you that he was always at the table in their business affairs, but never at the head of the table, and that he patiently struck down the clockmakers of Bristol, one by one, until he alone sat at the table? What if I told you that this instigator had relatives and agents in New Haven, in Waterbury, and in Ansonia, developing a secret network of leverage that could be used to firebomb a factory or buy out a clock shop, using every calamity, every financial panic, every moment of vulnerability to his own advantage? And what if I told you that the instigator is not Theodore Terry or J.C. Brown? In fact, all the evidence points to another, the true instigator of Bristol's decline, and the name of this mastermind is Eliza Welsh. Nathan, an incredible charge. He's the richest man in Bristol. Of course, Mr. Peck. He planned it to be this way. Welsh was a man of the foundry. More than anyone else in Bristol, Welsh knew the dynamics of heat and flame, of how a fire could create or destroy. He also lacked the large investment needed to expand his foundry operations in Bristol's expensive downtown, and so he removed to Forestville on the fringe of Bristol's urban and political center. But let's connect the dots here directly. It was Welsh who invited Israel Holmes to Bristol to start up the Bristol Brass Company, which, soon after its founding, immediately forced its shareholders to pay their options or be forced out, leaving Welsh as the controlling interest and current leader of Bristol's largest brass factory. And when Theodore Terry sold his shares of Bristol Brass and moved his money over to Ansonia to support a rival brass mill, what happened next? Fire immediately struck Theodore's operations. A bit of convenient timing, and maybe an act of revenge against a rival brass mill nearby, no? But wait, there's more. When J.C. Brown's factories in Forestville went up in flames and eventually into bankruptcy, who was the chief creditor that bought up all the shares and took over J.C. Brown's clock business? Our instigator, Welsh. When Jerome went bankrupt in New Haven because of the poison pill of debt forced upon him by P.T. Barnum, who profited? Welsh, or in this case, Welsh's brother, Harmonius, who served as the Welsh family's primary agent in New Haven. Harmonius used his financial connections in the New Haven banking scene to buy up Jerome's clock assets at a discount price. Then he turned right around and started up a new clock enterprise named the New Haven Clock Company. Even Jerome's loyal employee, who had been with him since the beginning, Hiram Camp, he came over to work for the Welsh's new clock company. Imagine the sting of it all for Jerome, when just like in Bristol, he loses everything and must leave town again to start over. But this time, his loyal first mate abandons him to join the Welshes. And let's remember how this chain of calamity in New Haven destroyed the livelihood of another forceful clockmaker, Hendrik, a man so aggrieved by it all that he committed suicide by drowning himself in the river. But look here, who do we see profiting from Hendrik's death? Who bought Hendrik's house at the forceful auction at the lowest price and then moved his table and his bed into a mansion that was raised for Hendrik's family? Again, Welsh. And who knows what other plots Welsh is hatching right now, sitting by the fireplace that once warmed Hendrik, a clockmaker who is no more. Eliza Welsh, Mr. Peck. He is the arsonist behind Jerome's fires, and dare I say, he is the man responsible for a long campaign of destruction in this town. And let me finish with this, because you must understand the soul of a man to know what he's capable of. Ask any clockmaker from Bristol, what does a clock mean? What does it represent? What is the purpose of a clock? You'll get many different answers, but they will come from the heart. Ask Welsh what is the purpose of a clock, and he'll return you one word: profit. Let's remember Welsh's favorite line of negotiation whenever he sold his bells or his weights on credit. He'd say, "Don't give me notes, give me clocks." To Welsh, clocks are currency. Better than paper money, or even gold, in fact. Welsh figured out that the value of paper money could fluctuate drastically during times of financial panic. He knew that a gold nugget saved under the bed would return nearly the same value a year later. But clocks, finished clocks, were more valuable than paper or gold. A finished clock could be sold for double or triple its value just by transporting it to the southern market or keeping it in the warehouse until there was a spike in demand or a short in supply. So when a major manufacturer like Jerome happened to lose his factories while those hungry New York merchants demanded clocks for wholesale, Welsh just happened to have a stockade full of finished clocks to sell at just the right moment at the highest price, didn't he? These are the laws of supply and demand, yes, but when you play with fire, they become something else. So all the evidence, Mr. Peck, points to Welsh. And knowing his disposition, we know that he won't stop. Right at this moment, he already has full control of brass production and nearly all of the clock production here in Bristol. Even now, I see him expanding his brother's cotton mills in Waterbury and Ansonia, maneuvering in ways to get leverage in the textile business. He's coming for me now. And at my textile mill, we're making advanced preparations to safeguard our business interests. Whether it be firebomb or bankruptcy, he's coming for me. He's coming for us all. And the final question that must be asked is this, Mr. Peck. What will Bristol look like once it all belongs to one man? What will become of our community when we are no longer makers, inventors, investors, free and independent, but all of us just workmen for Welsh? We must act now. Tomorrow, we must convene the town's leadership and allow me to make the same petition to them that I just made to you. Nathan, these are very serious accusations. So we must move carefully, not with haste, but with purpose, earning our allies one at a time. Because just as you deduced, Welsh has his ears, his agents, in many places. We don't know who here in Bristol is complicit in all these devious acts that you allege. But listen, the toughest part lies ahead. Convince the public we need actual evidence of Welsh's collusion to support the circumstantial case against him that you've just laid out. You tell a convincing story, Nathan, but we'll need more than coincidences to convince the unbelievers. Agreed, Mr. Peck. And to this necessity, I've also given some thought. There is one place where we'll find our hard evidence, the town clerk's office. The clerk's ledgers serve as a written history of all of Bristol's business affairs. Records which will no doubt illuminate all these repeated, suspicious circumstances where Welsh's traps of leverage and loans directly connect to a prominent clockmaker's calamity or bankruptcy. And these are public records, Mr. Peck, inviolable, and they will prove our case. A smart idea, Nathan. Yes, you're right. But for now, it's late. Let's sleep on these impulses. Tomorrow, you and I shall make a new plan to secure those records from the town clerk, get our evidence, and bring it all to the eyes of the public. I must admit, Mr. Peck, it's a great weight off my back to finally share it all with you. This mission has been a secret belt of burden, strung around me for so long. Years of careful investigation. A long time, Nathan. And in that time, who else have you told of all this? Just you, Mr. Peck. A few others knew what I was investigating. Mr. Barnes, a few of my workmen that I trust. But I never revealed my conclusions. Until now. Very good. Until tomorrow, Nathan. Rest well. Tomorrow, good sir. Tomorrow. Nathan rides off into the night to return home and prepare for the trials ahead. Elsewhere in town, on that very night, in the early morning hours when the streets are empty of their bystanders and witnesses, a shadowy figure approaches a mailbox near the downtown post office and drops a letter inside. The next morning, a mail courier will visit the mailbox and retrieve its contents, then deliver them to various locations around town. One letter will be carried by this courier to the post office in Forestville, where it will change hands with another courier and then arrive at its final destination, the factory office of E.N. Welsh. Eliza Welsh will open the letter and read 6 words, a coded message. It's a message that could be mistaken for a simple weather report, unless you knew its clandestine meaning. 6 words, patch the roof, dark skies ahead. Nathan had created the perfect plan to expose Welsh as the mastermind who unfairly manipulated Bristol's fortunes for so many years. After presenting his case and gaining the support of Tracy Peck, Bristol's most prominent lawyer, Nathan set in motion his next move, a surprise audit of the town clerk's business records to secure the hard evidence to convict Welsh in the court of public opinion. It would be the final dramatic blow to take down Welsh. But that's not what happened. Here, in the lobby of Town Hall, we find Nathan, Peck, and Alfonso Barnes, waiting for their request to review the town clerk's records to be granted. But in a surprising turn of events, it's not the clerk, but the wily politician Silas Gridley who greets them. Gentlemen, my town clerk informs me that you're here to audit my town account ledgers. What's the meaning of this? Alfonso puffs his chest in response. Silas, as a community business owner and registered voter, I'm here to formally request access to the townspeople's public ledger, as well as other necessary records my lawyer, Mr. Peck here, may deem appropriate. As you, Silas, being an honorable selectman of the town, may be aware, it has come to light that many of the town's creditors have not been paid in a timely manner by Town Hall. And now there's a general suspicion of fraud and deficiency in the town's accounts. We're here to audit the accounts, in order to help you clarify all these baseless allegations, of course. Not a worry, I'm sure we'll have all this cleared up by lunchtime, so if you please. Alfonso moves towards the stairs, but Silas blocks him. Well, gentlemen, you're out of luck, because the clerk's records were recently mislocated. Lost, I'm afraid. Which ones? All of them, I'm quite sorry to report. But as you know, me being an honorable selectman of the town, as you say, I've begun an investigation, an inspection, and I'm sure to have the logbooks found again in a short matter of time, although it's impossible to predict how long this will take, of course. Well, isn't it quite convenient, Silas, that the subject of our inquiry goes missing at the exact moment of our request? I understand how it looks, gentlemen, but it doesn't change the fact that what you're looking for is no longer available. Incredulous! We're going to make a full report about this, Silas. You should be prepared to answer in front of the town committee. We'll have you censored. Do as you wish, Mr. Barnes. But it won't be my first time in front of the town committee. Just remember, one of us standing here is an elected official, and one of us is a businessman with a private interest. Ask those workers on the street who they trust more. My books, wherever they are clean. Nathan is dismayed, but undeterred. He corrals his 3 closest allies, Peck, Barnes, and Thomas, for a meeting to discuss their next move after the failed attempt to use the town clerk's records as evidence against Welsh. But here again, we find things do not go as Nathan had expected. Instead of allies, Nathan finds opponents. Tracy Peck is the first to withdraw his hat from the ring. I have to say, gentlemen, I don't see a way forward here. We have conclusions, but we have no hard evidence to back them up. From a legal perspective, Nathan, we don't have a case that will stand up in court, or even public opinion. You can shame Welsh with your well-articulated conclusions, but it will be just that, a shaming, using coincidences of calamities of whose origin you cannot prove. And that's a dangerous gambit. Welsh could come out stronger than before. Hell, he could even claim to be the savior of Bristol by buying up all those clock businesses and employing their workers, saving them from total collapse. Nathan, however, is determined to find his footing despite Peck's objections. He turns to Thomas. Thomas, don't you have anyone from the workers who can serve as witnesses, give sworn statements about the things they saw and heard on the factory front lines? Nathan, you have to understand, Welsh is now Bristol's biggest employer of immigrants. Not just the Irish, all them others too. Mr. Peck is right. Welsh is offering jobs and livelihoods now. You can't ask them to bite the hand that feeds them. Plus, we all know the courts are just as anti-Irish as the politicians like Silas down at Town Hall. You can put us on the stand, but I dare you to find a jury or a judge that'll believe us. Nathan persists. But where does this leave us? Alfonso? Nathan, I think you accomplished a great deal here. What you uncovered gives us the power to erect some proper defenses around our community, should Welsh think to come after more of our compatriots. But so far as holding him accountable for everything else he's done, I just don't see how it's going to be possible right now. If the political winds change, we catch him holding a proverbial bloody dagger, then we can leap right up and cry wolf. But for right now, Nathan, go home to your family. Get back to work. Grow that company of yours. Welsh will make another mistake soon. Kingpins like him can't help it. And when he does, we'll be ready to expose him. Sometimes, Nathan, I have to remind myself that we aren't always in control. Some things can't be solved by men. Some things can only be solved by time. Nathan is devastated. The four men part ways, and Nathan's years of investigative work is left adrift. Except for one little victory, a public declaration is made, but not against Welsh, against Silas Gridley. Thanks to Barnes and Peck, the town committee issues an independent resolution accusing Silas of embezzlement, of wanton and purposeful destruction of the town's accounts, a thing uncalled for unless there was iniquity in his accounts, reports, and doings. But a resolution is not true justice. Silas remained in elected office, and Welsh kept charge of Bristol's industrial supremacy. Nathan thought his mission was over, a failed quest. But life always goes on, doesn't it? And some things that we believe are finished become, in time, quite unfinished. So now here we find Nathan and his wife Adeline sitting at their dinner table. There's the sound of giggling children in the next room, but Nathan's mood is serious and somber. He's just staring down at his food, playing with his fork, but not eating anything. Nathan, darling, I can tell you've got something on your mind. Why don't you put it here on the table so we could put a fork in it too? For the first time, Nathan opens up to Adeline. He tells her about the mission to uncover the villain responsible for the town's business calamities, and also how the mission gave him a purpose that convinced him to finally settle down in Bristol, to forego his adolescent wanderings. He shares his frustrations about striving to prove his conclusions, only to find inaction and indecision among those he believed to be his partners in the endeavor. Addie, I'll tell you how it feels because I felt it before. Just like when I reached the end of my travels on that distant island with nothing but endless ocean in front of me. I feel to have finished this long, arduous journey, but with no great victory. Just another expanse of emptiness at the end. Well, Nathan, I have to say, hearing all this for the first time, It does help me understand a lot of things about you and your grumpiness and anxiety all these years. But I do have one conclusion of mine that I'd like to share. Because sometimes it takes the intelligence and wisdom of a woman to show an accomplished man like yourself something that should have been obvious from the start. All right, Addie, I'm listening. Well, in all of this investigative snooping around, did anyone ever think to just go up to Chauncey Jerome himself and ask him who burned down his factory? Interview Jerome? Well, why? If he knew who burned down his factories, he would have said it from the onset. Maybe and maybe not. But you don't know, Nathan, because you never talked to him. For Pete's sake, you're going around accusing everybody of criminal acts, but maybe he lit his own fire. It's at least a lead worth following up. Or if you're pretty convinced that this Welsh did it all, then you might want to go down and tell Jerome who you believe burned down his factory. I imagine he might appreciate hearing your conclusions on the matter. In either case, it'll help you put this thing to bed, so I can finally get my husband back smiling and laughing again at our dinner table. Addie, I love you. You're quite the gal, you know that. Flattery will get you nowhere, Mr. Birge, but a little help cleaning the dishes might do wonders for you. And so thanks to Adeline, Nathan's mission begins again. One more hill to climb. Find and interview Chauncey Jerome. To be continued in the next chapter of the mission.